The rain fell steadily against the wide windows of Rosie's diner that evening, and the neon signs outside cast soft reflections across the checkered floor inside. It was the kind of place that had stood on that corner for 40 years, and the kind of place where coffee was always hot and the pie was always homemade. Natasha wiped down the counter for what felt like the 100th time that shift. Her feet ached and her back reminded her she wasn't 20 anymore, but she smiled anyway because that's what you did. She had learned long ago that kindness cost nothing, and sometimes it was all a person needed. The dinner rush had passed and only a few tables remained occupied. An older couple sat by the window sharing a slice of apple pie. A truck driver nursed his third cup of coffee at the counter. And in the corner booth sat an elderly man in a wheelchair wrapped in a cream-colored blanket. Natasha had noticed him when he first arrived about an hour ago. He had been wheeled in by a younger woman who seemed hurried and distracted. The woman ordered soup for him and then spent most of her time on her phone, barely looking up. When she finally left saying she'd be back in 20 minutes, the old man sat there alone with his bowl of soup cooling in front of him untouched. Something about the way he sat there so quiet and still with his silver hair falling across his forehead tugged at Natasha's heart. She had seen that look before. It was the look of someone who was present but somehow far away. She finished wiping the counter and walked over to his table. The soup had gone cold and a thin film had formed on top. "Excuse me, sir," she said gently, "would you like me to warm that up for you?" The man looked up at her with pale blue eyes that seemed both distant and deeply kind. He didn't speak, but there was something in his expression that told her he understood. "Let me get you a fresh bowl," she said. "This one's gone cold and nobody should have to eat cold soup." She returned a few minutes later with a steaming bowl of chicken noodle soup and a warm roll with butter. She set it down in front of him and noticed his hands trembling slightly as they rested on the arms of his wheelchair. He looked at the soup and then at her, and she understood without words being spoken. "Would it be all right if I helped you?" she asked softly. He nodded just slightly and something like relief passed over his face. Natasha pulled up a chair beside him and picked up the spoon. She blew gently on the first spoonful to cool it and then brought it carefully to his lips. He took it slowly and she waited patiently before offering another. "There you go," she said quietly, "nice and warm, just the way soup should be." They continued like this in comfortable silence. Between spoonfuls she would tear off small pieces of the roll and butter them, offering them to him with the same gentle care. She didn't rush. She didn't check her watch. She simply sat with him as if there was nowhere else in the world she needed to be. "You know," she said softly as she offered him another spoonful, "my father used to love soup. Every Sunday my mother would make a big pot and we'd all sit around the table together. Those were good days, simple days." The old man's eyes seemed to focus a bit more and the corner of his mouth lifted slightly as if he was remembering something similar. "I miss him," Natasha continued, "but I'm grateful for the time we had. Grateful for every meal we shared, every conversation. You learn as you get older that those moments are what matter. Not the big things but the small ones. The everyday kindnesses." She didn't notice the man standing near the entrance watching them. He had come in quietly about 10 minutes earlier and had simply stood there, observing the scene in the corner booth. Thomas Hartwell was not accustomed to standing unnoticed. As the founder and CEO of one of the largest real estate development firms in the country, he was used to people recognizing him, catering to him, jumping at his requests. But tonight he stood in this modest diner and watched something that money couldn't buy. He watched a waitress in a teal uniform with tired eyes and worn shoes sitting with his father, feeding him soup with more tenderness and patience than Thomas had managed to show in months, maybe years. His father, Robert Hartwell, had been a powerful man once. A self-made businessman who had built his fortune from nothing and had taught Thomas everything he knew about success, ambition and perseverance. But Alzheimer's had stolen so much from him. The sharp mind, the quick wit, the commanding presence. Now he was a shadow of who he had been, and Thomas had hired a rotation of caregivers to manage his care because he himself didn't know how to be present with this version of his father. Earlier that evening the caregiver had called saying she needed to step out for a personal emergency and asked if Thomas could come sit with his father for just an hour. Thomas had been in the middle of reviewing contracts for a major deal, but something in her voice made him agree. He had driven across town to the care facility, picked up his father, and not knowing what else to do had taken him to this diner. He had intended to stay, but then his phone rang with an urgent call about the contracts and he had stepped outside to take it. One call had led to another and before he knew it 40 minutes had passed. When he came back inside expecting to find his father sitting alone, he instead found this scene. This moment of simple human kindness. Natasha was just offering the last spoonful of soup when she sensed someone approaching. She looked up to find a tall man in an expensive suit standing beside the table. His face was composed but his eyes held something she couldn't quite read. "I'm so sorry," she said quickly, standing up. "I didn't mean to overstep. He was just sitting here and the soup was getting cold and I thought." "Please," Thomas said, raising his hand gently, "don't apologize." He looked down at his father, who seemed more peaceful than Thomas had seen him in weeks. There was soup on his chin and crumbs on his blanket, but his eyes were calm and there was the faintest trace of a smile on his lips. "Thank you," Thomas said, and his voice was rougher than he intended. "Thank you for taking care of him." Natasha smiled. "It was no trouble at all. He's a sweet man. You can see it in his eyes." Thomas nodded, unable to speak for a moment. He had been so focused on managing his father's condition, on the logistics and the schedules and the medical appointments, that he had forgotten to simply see him. To sit with him. To be present. "I'm Thomas," he said, extending his hand, "and this is my father Robert." "Natasha," she replied, shaking his hand, "and it was truly my pleasure." Thomas sat down across from his father and really looked at him. "You know," he said quietly, "I've been so busy trying to make sure he has the best care, the best doctors, the best facilities, that I forgot what he actually needs. What we all need." Natasha listened, saying nothing. "Someone to sit with us," Thomas continued, "someone to see us as we are. Someone to offer simple kindness without expecting anything in return." "Well," Natasha said gently, "that's what we're here for, isn't it? To take care of each other." Over the next hour Thomas sat with his father and Natasha stopped by the table periodically to refill water glasses and chat. She told them about her life, her grown children, her little apartment above the bakery. Thomas found himself talking more openly than he had in years, sharing stories about his father from before the illness, about the lessons he had learned, about the man Robert had been. Robert didn't speak, but he was present in a way that mattered. His eyes moved between them and occasionally he would reach out and Thomas would take his hand. When it was finally time to leave, Thomas asked for the check. Natasha brought it over and he looked at the total. $12.50 for soup and coffee. He pulled out his wallet and placed 5 $100 bills on the table. "Oh no," Natasha said immediately, "that's far too much. It's not nearly enough," Thomas said quietly, "for what you gave us tonight." But Natasha gently pushed the money back. "Except for $20. I can't accept that. I didn't do it for money. I did it because it was the right thing to do." Thomas looked at her for a long moment and then he nodded. "Then let me do something else. I'd like to set up a fund in your name for people in this community who need help. Medical bills, groceries, whatever they need. Would you be willing to help administer it? To make sure it goes to the people who need it most?" Natasha's eyes filled with tears. "Are you serious?" "Completely," Thomas said. "You've reminded me tonight what really matters. And I want to honor that. I want my father's legacy to be about kindness, not just business." 3 months later, the Rosie's Diner Community Fund had helped over 50 families in the neighborhood. Thomas had scaled back his work hours and had started spending his afternoons with his father. Sometimes they would sit in silence. Sometimes Thomas would read to him. Sometimes they would go to the diner and Natasha would sit with them during her breaks. Robert passed away peacefully in his sleep 6 months after that rainy evening. At his funeral, Thomas told the story of the waitress who had shown him what love really looked like. How it wasn't grand gestures or expensive gifts, but the willingness to sit with someone in their need, to offer comfort without conditions, to see the person beyond the circumstances. Natasha attended the funeral along with dozens of people from the neighborhood whose lives had been touched by Robert's legacy of kindness that his son had continued in his honor. After the service, Thomas approached Natasha. "Thank you," he said, "for everything. For showing me how to be a better son. For reminding me what my father taught me all along but I had forgotten. That our worth isn't measured by what we accumulate but by how we treat people, especially when they need us most." Natasha hugged him. "Your father was proud of you. I could see it in his eyes every time he looked at you those last months. You gave him a beautiful gift by being present. As they stood there in the afternoon sunlight, Thomas realized that the most valuable thing he had ever received hadn't come from a business deal or an investment. It had come from a waitress in a small diner who had taken the time to feed his father soup, and in doing so had fed his soul. Sometimes the greatest wealth isn't what we have but what we give away. And sometimes the most important moments in our lives happen when we slow down long enough to see them. In a world that moves so fast, it's easy to forget that we're all just people trying to do our best, trying to find meaning, trying to connect. But every now and then someone comes along and reminds us. Someone who asks for nothing and gives everything that matters. Someone who teaches us that kindness is never wasted and love is never too late, and the simple act of caring for another person is the most powerful thing we can do. That evening, as Natasha returned to her shift at the diner, she looked around at the familiar booths, the worn counter, the coffee pot that had been brewing since morning, and she smiled. Because she understood something that took some people a lifetime to learn. Home isn't always a place. Sometimes it's a moment. Sometimes it's a choice we make to show up for each other, to be present, to offer what we can even when it seems small. And in those moments we find what we've been searching for all along. Not success or recognition or reward, but something deeper. Something true. We find our shared humanity and the quiet peace that comes from knowing we made someone's day a little bit easier, their burden a little bit lighter, their heart a little bit fuller. That is enough. That has always been enough.